Gallaudet University presents.
She will be available for a book signing after the presentation. And you also will get a 20% discount on the book today. And that is being made available from the Gallaudet Press. So hopefully that will be an incentive for you to buy the book and stay after to have it signed. And what better way to get to know an author than to have a presentation. So thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing your lecture this afternoon. Thank you, Tom, for the very nice introduction. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to partake in the VL2 presentation series. I'll be talking to you today about two research studies that I've conducted. The first was my dissertation work, and the second is a study that I've done as a part of my postdoctoral position. Both have to do with ASL and early intervention in my home province of Ontario, Canada. Now, because I am not from the US, if there's anything that I may sign that you don't understand, please feel free to interrupt. I thought I would take a moment first, though, to talk to you a bit about my background and qualifications to understand how I came to be involved in the field. For 4 years, I worked with the Ontario Cultural Society of the Deaf. And my position there was to facilitate workshops for the community on the topic of instruction, family instructors. They're also called deaf mentors. We refer to them as literacy consultants, specifically ASL literacy consultants. Prior to having that position, there really were no standardized ways of training parents on what information they would need to know. So this is what I did in that capacity. The Ontario government around that time established a newborn infant hearing screening program and an IHP program, and so I provided services for ASL through that program until the year 2005. In 2006, The Ontario Association of the Deaf appointed me to conduct a research paper having to do with the availability and lack thereof of services around ASL for deaf children from birth to 5. Because the policy is that if children receive a cochlear implant, they must enroll in auditory verbal therapy, which I'll be calling AVT, and this is referenced in the article that some of you may have received. And the other points on this slide have to do with when and where I earned my degree, which Tom already mentioned to you. Before talking about this slide, it's important that we all understand the social construction of disability. And I want to be sure that my audience is familiar with that, and that there is a difference in the perspective of whether a person has a disability and is therefore lacking, or whether society and the way in which society is constructed then causes this person to be disabled. And the implications that these two beliefs have on the reactions that parents would have when they find out that their newborns are deaf. This can determine whether you take the approach to be accepting or you're grieving, whether you learn sign language or use strictly auditory and oral approaches. Keeping that in mind, a study was conducted on a group of 153 Canadian deaf children. 93% of these children were enrolled in an auditory verbal therapy program, and 67% of these children were educated orally, but only 58% were educated orally in elementary school, and 31% were educated orally in adolescence. I'm accustomed, by the way, to giving this presentation to hearing audiences, and they often don't understand what it means to be educated orally, but I think it's safe to assume that this audience will understand what that means. What we can understand happens then in reality with these children is that as the years pass, these children fall further and further behind in their educational progress, and their parents eventually turn to signing programs for their children's education. This study was conducted in 2000, and prior to that, this was prior to the infant hearing program that the government established. And it was believed that the infant hearing program would then remediate the issue of language delay. So the government felt that the IHP program was then sufficient to take care of this issue, but in my view, it only entrenched this belief further into policy, creating further complications. This is an excerpt from my article. That addresses the implications of universal newborn hearing screenings that are commonplace now across North America. Ontario was the first province in Canada to establish it. It's now in Quebec and in British Columbia, but it has been around for much longer in Ontario. And what this policy means is that when a deaf child is identified as being deaf, they are automatically entered into this system. Now, on one hand, this may seem like a very good approach, especially to the deaf community, to identify children as being deaf as young as possible so that they can get as much language exposure, particularly exposure to a sign language, as early as possible. But what in fact has happened is that these children have been tracked towards an auditory verbal approach, and there hasn't been much research on what this has meant for the lives of these children. The parents of these children are presented with the option of enrolling their children in the audio-verbal therapy approaches, which many of us are familiar with, which encourages exclusively the use of auditory and oral communication. ASL is the second option that they're presented with, and the third is a dual approach, which is, in theory, supposed to be a combination of the audio-verbal and signed approaches. The problem with that, though, is if parents choose to have their child implanted with a cochlear implant, they are required to choose the AVT option. Therefore, they cannot get the ASL services that they may want. And there are very few children who don't receive cochlear implants. The vast majority of deaf children in Ontario are fitted with cochlear implants. And the fact that the AVT philosophy prohibits use of sign language then in effect means that that is the policy of the Ontario government. I would argue, though, particularly based on the results of that Ontario deaf study from 2000, that these sorts of approaches lead people to only consider signing if the benefits of a cochlear implant are not realized, and if they are in essence considered an oral failure. Another argument that has been recently introduced, I should make note, by the way, that the emphasis in this quote is added, is that they say that if parents don't already know how to sign and they end up having a deaf child, it's not even worth pursuing developing proficiency in ASL. Because they say that no matter what, if the parents don't already know ASL, this deaf child will be facing language delays. Now, the logic that this is based on is weak because there are hearing parents that have learned sign language. There are parents that say that they will use only one language, for example, maybe sign only and not use their voice, but we know that parents will. So what I'll focus on is the prospect of teaching parents how to sign and the effectiveness of that. And even if parents learn how to sign as non-natives, that will not result in language delays or impair the acquisition of language of their deaf children. Some of the studies that you'll see I list here are somewhat old, but that has to do with the fact that since the advent of these universal newborn hearing screenings, there has not been a good deal of research because it was viewed as though the problem was solved. But I think that, in effect, quite the opposite has happened. That the approach that professionals take leave parents feeling that their child being deaf is something that they should grieve over. And that has to do with a very medicalized model of what it means to be deaf. There is an alternative view, one in which you recognize being deaf as being a member of a culture. There's also the view that interventions are necessary on the part of the child, but the parents of these deaf children also need intervention and support. The third quote is one that I excerpted from a study by Young, or excuse me, the first quote is one that I excerpted from Young, where he interviewed parents in England about their experiences learning BSL when they found out that their children were deaf. These parents reported that they enjoyed meeting deaf people in the deaf community and they enjoyed learning sign language, but what struck them most and what they grappled with most was the understanding that they had an identity as a hearing person that their deaf child did not share. And they all described being struck by that, but they also described how helpful it was because it helped them to understand that there was a linguistic and cultural way of viewing deaf people, not just viewing deafness as a medical diagnosis. Related to Young's study, I also have chosen to focus a good deal on the parental experience. The quote earlier from Lee and her colleague was that parents can never gain sufficient fluency in ASL. But I think that that point of view really comes from a linguistic proficiency framework, which has the expectation that anyone that undertakes the endeavor of learning a second language must become native-like. And that may be true for someone who aims to become a teacher of deaf children or an interpreter, but the aims of a professional are very different than the aims of a parent. A parent doesn't need to have necessarily native-like competence. They aren't seeking to pass a test. They're seeking to communicate. And communication entails playing with your child, reading stories to them, telling stories to them, interacting on a daily basis. And quite unfortunately, existing curricula modeled for L2 learners don't necessarily suit the needs of parents. Another way of considering, then, the fluency needed by parents is by considering plurilingualism, which looks at when people learn languages for different purposes at different ages, and the fact that they may reach different levels of fluency, but all of those levels of fluency are beneficial. And you can still encourage people to learn languages, regardless of what their proficiency may result in being. And a good support for this comes from the research of Kushulnagar, who looked at the relationships between deaf people and their parents, and the fact that it turned out to be correlated with these deaf people's own quality of life. So this shows that there are far-reaching implications for parental decisions about communication with their children. Another point that I'd like to bring up today has to do with ASL literacy, and even just considering the connotation of how we typically sign literacy. There is a connotation of reading and writing print, but this does not reference one's cognitive abilities to assess what they're reading or writing. I would argue that literacy is gained through interacting in a discourse. It's a social practice. So when children and their parents are learning how to sign, they're not merely learning a language, they're also learning cultural ways of being and interacting, ways to get attention, and so of another person that you may want to communicate with. So then language and literacy becomes a performance. You perform literacy as opposed to simply having a given skill. And I think that viewing literacy in such a narrow, restricted way reinforces that medicalized notion of deaf people, and it disregards the cultural and linguistic and social approaches. This brings me to the first study that I'd like to talk about. And this is my doctoral dissertation research, which was an 8-week program. And I chose to conduct this as action research because, as some of you may know, a good deal of the existing research is primarily quantitative and primarily negative. I chose to undertake qualitative research by way of an action research framework. I engaged as a participant observer. So it was not simply that I was sitting off in the corner of a room monitoring others' interactions, but I also interacted with the parents involved in this program. At the outset of this research, I first identified the problem and then proposed a solution, which was the ASL Parent-Child Mother-Goose program. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. Before undertaking my research, I did know that I wanted to be involved with hearing parents who have deaf children who had already likely been involved with our 3 large national hospitals that require parents to go for AVT therapy. And I knew that by engaging with these organizations, I would be able to recruit parents. But there's also a deaf service agency that services deaf and hearing parents, and this is the program that I worked under. And this takes a very nice approach in that it's much more inclusive than the AVT approach required by the hospitals.
The ASL Child Mother Goose program was established in 2003 by OCSD in partnership with the Hearing Mother Goose program that had already been in place for quite some time. It was a program for parents to learn how to read stories and poems in a rhythmic way to their children, to encourage that parent-child bond. Partnering these 2 organizations allowed for a much more successful study. We did not borrow a lot of the tools from that study because we had to establish our own tools in ASL. It was quite an undertaking. As many of you know, ASL does have rhymes in terms of repetition of hand shapes and movement, where signs are placed, the location. Most frequently we see hand shapes, the repetition of hand shapes as ASL rhyme. Peekaboo animals is one where we see this tool used. So the 5 hand shaped is used by showing these signs in repetition. And these refer to animals using the closed B hand shape and what we commonly call the claw hand shape. ASL rhymes, or the proficiency of knowing these ASL rhymes, will enhance a child's metalinguistic capabilities, regardless of their deaf or hearing. If these children are exposed to nursery rhymes in ASL, first it will elicit a much more rich understanding of the language and its phonological aspects. Children will develop bilingual awareness of rhymes in both languages. An ASL phonological awareness is the result of this exposure. ASL phonology now much more is being studied as how it ties into reading, or the ability to develop reading skills. And it shows that having that awareness is correlated with high levels of literacy. I'm going to take a moment and show a clip of the Mother Goose program in action. The male you will see is the program leader, and he's working with a mother who's reading a story. They're going to be using 2 hand shapes. The story is about a dog who is running around, comes across a bone, picks up that bone in its mouth, tries to hide the bone. So you get the idea. The entire story is produced using 2 hand shapes. So in this clip, you see the ASL mentor is instructing the parents on the correct way to produce the sign, the directionality of the sign, some aspects of what a dog may actually do. As you see it showing the dog's tail. Continuing to be a language model for all the parents. You see the deaf mentor telling the baby to watch as the child's mother will then take responsibility for signing the story. And there you see, they elicited a response from this very young child. That's the Mother Goose Action Program. Action Research Program. Now, my next study involved early intervention, but I wanted to expand its focus. We used children's books signed in American Sign Language. And the difference between the second study compared to my first one, well, first of all, it was a little bit more difficult. Within my first study, I wasn't responsible for running a program. The organizations that I was working with were much more, took that responsibility on. I could sit back and be more of a participant and truly a researcher. The second study, I then became primarily responsible for coordinating the study and gathering the research as well. This study continued for 10 months. It was quite a long study. Within this study, the second study, it was all hearing parents with deaf children. 5 families participated in the beginning. 2 remained with us until the end. The other 3 dropped out at various points. And both of these families had children who were under the age of 3. The instructors came from a variety of different backgrounds. Some taught at deaf residential schools, some had other professions. All of them I deemed highly qualified. All of them had been trained as ASL instructors. Here at Gallaudet University, you have the shared reading program. That's a school-based program. This is much more community-based. It was hosted on a Saturday morning at Ryerson University, where they have an early childhood education center, so we were able to use that location and their facilities. As previously mentioned, I said ASL literacy could be, well, primarily is thought of to be how we take in information and interpret it. It's very much based in the culture in which we grow up in. As deaf people read a book and then sign it to their children, literacy is happening in a different way than hearing parents with hearing children. If most hearing parents were to sit down and read a book with their children, they would read the sentence that's printed on the page. They may add a little description of what they see of the picture, and then have a dialogue, an interaction between themselves and the child. Primarily, though, that is following what is printed on the book. From my observations, working with this special population, adding deaf people to this experiment, much more was described, and in a different way, in a more complex way. The use of classifiers was used to explain pictures on the page. There would be an event that happened in the story, and if there was some sort of gap between events, deaf parents typically filled in this gap. There's a book entitled The Snowy Day. The first page of this book shows a child, a boy. He wakes up and looks out of his window and sees the entire landscape white with snow. But he then goes outside. What I noticed is that the book doesn't explain that he gets up, he gets out of bed, he gets himself dressed, and then goes outside. In hearing culture, this may be assumed. I have noticed that when deaf parents read this story to their deaf children, those gaps are filled in. The deaf parent would explain, well, this boy has gotten up, he's gotten dressed, and gone outside to see the snow. This existing research with hearing parents, I found, is much different than the research I gained through my studies. There's also research out there done with older children. My focus was with children who are much younger. Whether or not deaf children are exposed to an oral language, sign language, or something in between, maybe total communication. But very few studies focused solely or primarily on ASL. Regardless if it's parents reading with their children or teachers reading with their students. My studies show, well, actually, my study is the only one that talks about teaching hearing parents how to read these books with their deaf children. The point of our mentors, the point of the entire program was to teach hearing parents that their children need to be involved. Once their children are involved in this discourse, once they're exposed to language at this age, at that level, that will be a strong predictor of literacy skills. Hearing parents with hearing children, when they're reading a story, sometimes they'll ask their children to take over, if you will. Pardon the interpreter. For hearing parents, the hearing children do not take as much of a role. It's very regulated by the parents. Not the case in my study, as I found with hearing parents and their deaf children. I have another clip from Vimeo of a person who's signing an excerpt from this book, Snowy Day. This clip starts off by the signer reading the title of the book and telling you the author's name. She's now modeling in ASL the English text. I wasn't quite sure if I should continue trying to get a read on my audience to see if you wanted to see more of how she was translating the book into American Sign Language, but I felt that gave you a good enough chunk to get the idea of what it looks like to truly translate an ASL from an English-based text without worrying too much about copyright issues. I hope you noticed, though, she did fill in those gaps, as I had mentioned earlier, that the English text was missing about the boy then getting up, getting dressed. She also talked a lot about how the snow had built up on the rooftops of the houses. Both of my studies had very rich implications. And as Tom mentioned, I do have a book that's on sale today. That book is based on the first study that I undertook. And I would like to now just touch on some of the information that I garnered from both studies. I think it's critical that parents are involved in an early intervention program, and research and findings from both my first and second study proves this. The Mother Goose program that is very beneficial primarily because of the parental involvement. One story called The Jolly Bear is signed in a very rhythmic way, again, using similar hand shapes, repetitive motion. And one thing that I noticed that a deaf mother added was actually signing signs that we would gloss for bear and different animals on the body of the child. And this baby absolutely loved it. You could tell by her facial expressions and her body language that she just wanted more. Now, the Mother Goose program had audiences that were both deaf and hearing. But what I noticed that fascinated me is that the program became not so much about how to sign specific words. It wasn't about reading stories. It was almost a lesson in deaf culture. And I really wanted that to flow. I thought that that was something that was a natural occurrence and something that was necessary to teach specific aspects of deaf culture. Hearing parents could then have an opportunity to complain about hearing aids, and then deaf parents would make them feel comfortable and say, that's okay, it's part of our life, it's an experience that we've had. So when you got deaf parents and hearing parents in the room together, I really noticed a synergy. I saw how much they could work together. In the 80s, in Sweden, there was a group of deaf and hearing parents that got together that undertook a similar endeavor. And through that group, from that group's work, Sweden's government then set up a bilingual policy for deaf children, which in the intervening decades has sort of wound down. It's not as strong as it once was, but still important nonetheless. Instruction, ASL instruction or ASL mentoring, whatever we want to call it, is very important. I see the role of early interventionists as being vital. These mentors aren't always paid. Sometimes it's a volunteer position. And in my book, there's one chapter that delves into that idea. Because most of the mentors I've seen are working on a volunteer basis, or they may be paid for 1 hour a week. And this did not include driving time. This did not include the time needed for preparation. On the contrary, audiologists, speech and language pathologists are professionals who earn a salary. So I want to push the idea that we need more training, we need the training to be standardized, and we need to see these deaf mentors as professionals on par with speech pathologists and audiologists in terms of how they are regarded as a profession. In my first study, we looked at name signs. Name signs was another aspect of deaf culture that we presented to deaf and hearing parents who took part in this research study. We talked about different aspects of ASL, role shifting, the grammar that's shown on the face, that's important for language and comprehension. We also followed the parents' lead. We found, though, that what parents wanted was an exact word-for-word correlation. They wanted to know exactly what sign went with what English word. And that's where I felt myself contradicted. I wasn't sure about the approach. Did they truly understand what the program was for? I wanted to make sure that the program was there to support their bond and their relationship with their children, that it wasn't necessarily ASL class for them to become proficient in the language. The two families that stayed in the program for its entirety did initially want just one sign for one English word, but they still stayed for that program in its entirety. So, implications for future research. What should early intervention programs entail? I would say, first of all, we need more of them. I would ask different communities to get together and try to identify what the ideal early intervention program looks like, what are the components of an early intervention program, and to challenge your notions of literacy. That concludes my presentation. I hope I didn't go too fast, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for some discussion or any questions that the audience members may have.
Should we have people line up on either side of the stage, or? Hi, thank you for doing that research and for coming. I wish I could see more research like that. Now, you said in the beginning, oh, sorry. Oh, wow, a lot of people right behind me. Oh, this is where I need to stand? Okay. So in your second study, you said that you started off with 5 families being involved, but only 2 continued throughout the entire program. Could you talk a little bit about why the 3 chose not to remain in the program, if you're allowed to? That's a good question. I should maybe have added that in the presentation. They didn't necessarily state their reasons outright, but I can tell you that 2 of the families who decided not to continue were involved in the AVT program. The 2 that did remain involved were not part of the AVT program. So I'm not sure if the 2 families stopped attending because they were told that they couldn't continue attending, or if they believed they shouldn't continue attending. So I can speculate as to why they didn't come, but I can't say for sure why they decided to stop attending the program. Am I in a good place? Outstanding presentation. I can't get enough of this topic, and your work is so critical to our community. You talked a bit about literacy and definitions of ASL literacy, which is a topic I am passionate about. And you said about midway through the presentation that you noticed patterns in how deaf people read books to children, that they would sort of fill in those gaps, they would make implicit things explicit, and that hearing parents, in contrast, would primarily stick to the words presented on the page. And this is something that I have thought about too in terms of a cultural norm. And I've wondered what that really means in terms of my own definition of literacy and what our societal definition is of literacy. And there have been a number of definitions offered. One that has to do with literacy really being about developing your cognitive abilities such that you can make inferences, engage in dialogues and interactions. So one point that I would make is that perhaps maybe instead of a deaf adult filling in those gaps for the child, could we instead let the child guess at filling in those gaps? So taking the Snowy Day book, for an example, and talking about the boy going outside and playing. I actually remember the story, and so I know that there's a part where he takes a snowball, puts it in his pocket, goes in the house, and then later you see a picture of the boy's shirt and the side of his pants being wet. But they don't explicitly say what caused his shirt and pants to be wet, but if you engage with a dialogue with the child, then they could start to put those dots together themselves and say, oh, well, the snow was cold, the inside the house it's warm, and maybe it melted. So the adult can then scaffold the child, and they can elicit these sorts of connections so that the adult isn't doing all of the thinking, but instead they're prompting the child to make those connections. So I think that would be a way of fostering literacy. What are your thoughts on that? I'm really happy you brought that up, actually. I am still in the data analysis portion of my study, of the second study, and so this is really an important consideration that you bring up. The deaf instructors that were involved in this study did at times elicit responses from the children, and often about the book The Snowy Day. And I do remember one deaf instructor saying to the child, well, hey, look at that, the little boy's shirt and pants are wet, what happened? And so they did prompt the child to come up with his or her own explanation. And that's something I'll keep in mind as I continue analyzing my data. Thank you. Hi, it's very nice to see you again, Kristin. I really enjoyed your talk. As was said, the work that you're doing is tremendously important and carries great value. Many hearing people look to deaf children and see only deficits. And they say, well, they can't read well because they don't have phonological awareness, and they don't have phonological awareness because they can't hear, and phonological decoding is so vitally important to reading. But they're missing something in that logic. What they're missing is the fact that ASL has its own phonology, and when a fluent signer engages with young children, that child is exposed to such rich phonology, and it still stimulates the right areas of the brain to develop cognitively, and they can still understand the phonological patterns that are in ASL, just like children who hear pick up on the phonological patterns in spoken language. And you are right that there is work in the literature that shows that deaf parents have this sort of intuitive knowledge about how to engage children with stories using rhyme, using phonological information of ASL in the way in which they share these stories. And so the children have this language model, and because of what they're exposed to, they're given the ability then to pick up on patterns which improve their literacy and proficiency, not only in ASL, but it allows them to bootstrap on what they know of ASL and develop their English proficiency. So their exposure to phonology of ASL provides a foundation for understanding patterns in English. I really think it's high time that educators in our educational system understands that there is a phonology in ASL and that we can capitalize on that to teach deaf children English. If you don't teach that ASL phonology, then you will see them struggling for their entire lives when they're trying to catch up in terms of their linguistic competency, because what they don't have is that firm foundation of language in the first place. Could you imagine teaching a bilingual child and speaking to them in French and only writing in English, but never teaching them how they can use what they know about French to learn how to read English? It's a normal thing that children use in their interactions. They know how to engage with people using ASL, but teachers aren't helping children understand how to use what they know about what they know about ASL to develop English literacy. And research shows that when children have ASL, an understanding of ASL phonology, they use that, and it's correlated with higher levels of literacy. And so this is information that parents need to know and need to apply. So thank you so much for your outstanding and just beautiful work. I'll echo that, really beautiful work. So, the big so is, what will it take to convince people that this is true? What do you think it will really take to make people understand that it is actually okay to sign with a child even if they have a cochlear implant? How do you convince people of that? Because parents are being told outright lies. That's a question I've often thought about myself. And it's, one that we've talked about in the community a great deal and that we have tried to work towards. And the answer I'm often left with is that we have to turn to legislative approaches. NAD, I think, gets funding, right? Several $100,000 of funding or something in that order. So why not propose something to the National Association to work towards a legislative action? And I should say that I understand that the infrastructure and the public health system may be different in Canada from the US. For public health, everything is free in Canada, but it's because we pay hefty taxes for it. So, if there were a policy in place, people would have to take accountability for it, and maybe that's why, for me, I often turn towards legislative solutions. But that's what I would have to say, and it's strictly because AVT is a policy for us in Canada, but that may not be the case here in the U.S. Hi, my name is Clifton Langdon. I'm a doctoral student here in the Department of Linguistics, and last week I was at a meeting where people were talking about your article, and one of the things that came up in that discussion, one of the themes, related to what Dr. Allen just said. And we talked about that it seems that there is some merit to taking approaches that are strictly scientifically based. But when you're interacting with parents who have young children, this relates to one of the slides that you have, I think you said something to the effect of parents going through a grieving process. That was part of what prompted this discussion last week at this meeting. You know, how can we better understand parents and their desire to engage emotionally with their children? And if we can understand that, then we need to approach them on an emotional level instead of shoving the science at them. Because our parents who are dealing with something in a highly emotional manner, connecting with their child, for example, are they able to distance themselves from their immediate situation and think at an abstracted level where they're thinking of research and outcomes? They're a lot more on the front line. I mean, my work has to do with language acquisition of young children, but I'm approaching it as a scientist. How do I then take what I know and frame it in an emotional way that can appeal to parents? So how do we package what we know in a way that they can be more receptive to it? And last week what we were saying is that then we need to approach our parents in an emotional manner, and of course not strictly emotionally, I mean with science in mind, but that making an emotional appeal can help us get our foot in the door to show them that we are connected, to come forward with the attitude of positivity and that signing and ASL is fine and that your child is fine. So given the topic that just came up, I thought that would be worth mentioning. Thank you. I absolutely agree. And in your comments about addressing a parent on an emotional level reminded me of the Mother Goose program, because it really does emphasize the emotional connection between parents and children, period. The fact that mothers and fathers love their children. And a lot of what gets emphasized in the Mother Goose program is ways that the parent can express to their child that they love them. And of course we are doing that with a scientific basis, because parents are learning how to say that playing with the phonological aspects of ASL, but it's on an emotional level. I agree that it's really important to interact with parents on an emotional level. But the problem is not so much science. The problem is that parents interact a good deal with medical professionals, and they come from a medical model. And that pathological, medicalized model results in them telling these parents, do not sign with your child. It will inhibit your child's language development. It will impede the development of their spoken language. It will lead them to have cognitive deficiencies, and then they won't have brain tissue left for developing speech and listening. So we really need to think about how to approach the doctors and medical professionals as well. You know, we've got our own problems in science, and I understand that, because there are prejudices and biases that we have within us that come from a result of growing up in a community that has biases. So I've seen that on a day in, day out basis. But in addition to thinking about parents, we need to think about how to interact with medical professionals and get them to understand that signing is not bad for children's brains. So we've got two fronts ahead of us and a lot of work to do. It's not impossible by any means, but it is a lot of work. Right, and I'd wonder, where do we start? With professionals who are working in the AVT programs? Do we start with audiologists? Do we start with physicians? Good point. Because it is an entire system, and it takes a lot to drive systematic change, and it requires the involvement of the entire deaf community. What I see happening now in Indiana and in California is the result of community action and pushing for what we believe in. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Gabrielle Arellano. I am a linguist, and I am a father of a 5-year-old who can hear, and I have been just absolutely fascinated by his language development of ASL, spoken language, written language. He's in a early childhood education program now at Kendall. And so my question for you and for audience members as well, and is based on my own experience, and this has to do with what you've just presented on. I saw Brenda Nicodemus give a presentation on prosody in ASL, and she talked about what happens during the prenatal stages of a child's life. That hearing children then are exposed to sounds in utero, and so, but they don't get exposed to books, for example. They don't get exposed to print. And that children end up being responsive in the very earliest days of their life to things that they have heard when they were in the womb. And so I wonder, what are the implications then for children who are in utero who are deaf, and parents don't know before their children are born that they're deaf, so they aren't signing until they're born. But if they start practicing that before their child is born, then that may have some interesting results. So I'm interested in knowing what your thoughts are on that, and what the reactions are of others in the audience. We also have lectures on campus from time to time from the Department of Hearing, Speech, and Language Sciences, and I sat in on one of their lectures the other week. I apologize for not being able to remember the person's name, but what was so intriguing to me about this person's presentation is that they were encouraging people to take action at a political level. This is someone who was late deafened. They had lost their hearing while serving in the U.S. in the military. And you know, on one hand, it's fantastic that that we have people like this come to campus, but you know, how do we, going back to what Tom said, how do we convince people that this is what we need to do? Do we work with people who are currently working in these programs? Do we work with adults who maybe have lost their hearing later in life? Will young deaf children relate to them? Will hearing parents of these deaf children relate to these adults? Okay, and I did have one more thing, if I may. In one of your slides, you made the point that hearing parents are often much more interested in learning signs for the words that are printed on the book, and that interest is really culturally rooted. It's because that's how they read their stories to their hearing children, and that in the deaf community, we don't always sign verbatim what you see in the book. But there are some connections, like what I saw in the video was that the narrator use the sign for snow repeatedly, much more often than I saw on the page, and I think that that repetition reinforces learning. And again, these are things that I'm seeing with my young son, and I definitely am encouraged about, the effectiveness of approaches like these. Sorry for taking so much time on the stage. Thank you. You brought up a lot of thoughts for me, but I'll respond to your last comment in terms of how to read books with children. Another pattern that I've noticed in how deaf adults read books to children is that no reading is the exact same as another. And as I've wondered about this, one answer that comes up is that it is an oral language. It's a face-to-face language. And so by virtue of being a language that's produced online and is not recorded, that it's always going to have some degree of spontaneity. But when you have text to read from, then you're tied to that text, so it will produce a different pattern. But it's not that when these people are reading the stories in ASL that they're completely disconnected from the text. In fact, they draw the children's attention to text, and they do repeat certain words.
I'm aware of where to stand this time. Thank you, Connie. I feel like sort of history is repeating itself. AVT is something that we're familiar with. It's something that's initially started, and then when children fail at that specific therapy method, they're transferred into a signing environment. So it seems like there has been this back and forth, and it's historical, and it keeps coming up, and it looks the same way. So someone made an interesting comment about how can we involve the community of speech and language hearing pathologists and work together with the deaf community. I have a hearing nephew who has a deaf brother who has a hearing son who doesn't sign. And he had twins who were both hearing, whose stepmom used ASL with them. They're going to speech therapy, and the speech therapy therapist said, you cannot use ASL because it's basically just gesture, and it will be detrimental to their language acquisition. And this stepmother actually sort of had quite an argument with this professional and said, no, this is the way. ASL is a language, it's a full-fledged language, and it's not just gestural, and it will not be any detriment to learning language. Thank you for bringing that up. It brings to mind that dual option that the IHP offers. The support, the ASL support, is not offered fully because it's not fully developed. As you were just talking about, there are professionals out there that don't believe in these models, and the model hasn't been perfected. In Ontario, about half of those signed up for AVT therapy continue with it, and the remainder go get like 4 hours of instruction in ASL, and the remainder is oral-based or speech-based. And so I think that the program can be developed in a better way. You mentioned history repeating itself, or communities, states, provinces getting stuck in a specific cycle. I can speak to Ontario. The infant hearing program has really hurt the deaf community. It's divided us, in some ways, against each other. We are fighting each other instead of fighting the government. And the government is who we really need to approach. But first we must unify ourselves. Only when we are unified will we then succeed. Hello. I very much appreciated your talk today. I'm a teacher at the Clare Center, and I have 2 deaf children, so I'm a mother. And sometimes, as a teacher and a mother, I feel like I am wearing 2 hats. I have 2 roles. At home, I always read to my children in American Sign Language, and as you mentioned, my version is never the same story twice, so to speak. In the classroom, I noticed that some of my colleagues, when they're signing a story, will add props. So things to help tell a story. And I'm wondering if these props truly stimulate students' thinking. I know that they're a wonderful support. But if we put the props aside and simply just signed, then the students are left to just think for themselves. So I'm wondering, do you support the use of props while reading stories to children? In my second study, one of the instructors used props, and I thought that was a wonderful way to engage the children. Initially, because they did not have a foundation. And props were things, they were manipulatives, they were things that children could play with. I think it would really depend on the situation. It would depend on your students in that class. But I think they could be useful. We do have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions, comments. If there are any out there in the audience. Well, Dr. Snoddon, your presentation led to a lot of good discussion and left us with a lot to think about. So thank you very much again for your wonderful talk today. We have a table set up over here where we're going to be selling Dr. Snoddon's book. You'll also be able to acquire a copy of her dissertation and her research. Please don't forget to fill out our evaluation form. Connie has those here in front. Your evaluations are very important to us. We use that as data, and we also report that information to the National Science Foundation, so we do appreciate you filling out those forms. The 2 lectures that are coming up within the next 3 weeks, one is from Rain Bosworth, who is a VL2 researcher. Her work is in visual perception, which is a different strand. And then another VL2 researcher, David Quinto Pozos, and he will be coming to talk with us about his research that focuses on the question of language difficulties for native signing deaf children. He'll talk about hearing people and their language and cognitive processes, and then use that information to talk about the deaf population. And to really explore the idea of language deficits. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll have another fascinating presentation coming up. So I hope you attend all of those remaining VL2 lecture series. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and we'll see you in 3 weeks.
This has been a production of Gallaudet University.